Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Tablas Creek Instagram live broadcast for this mid-November week. I am, as always, Jason Haas. My guest this week is Joel Peterson, the founder of Ravenswood and Once and Future Wine, and one of my own icons in the world of wine. I so admire what Joel has done over the years, what he's continuing to do now. And so I can't wait to hear his story. This will be the first time that I've had two generations from the same family on this Instagram Live. I spoke with his son, Morgan Twain Peterson of Bedrock Wine Company early this year or late last year sometime. So that'll be another first. It'll also be the second Joel Peterson that I've interviewed, which is kind of fun because, of course, our local Paso Robles Wine Country Alliance executive director is also named Joel Peterson. So anyway, I will be inviting Joel to join in just a couple minutes, but while we wait for everyone to sign on, I'm going to give you a little update as to what is going on in the vineyard. So share a few pictures. So early last week, we got our first rain of the year. We got about 1.5 inches over the course of 24 hours, including 3/4 of an inch in 1 hour. And I was curious to see how the vineyard held up. This is one of the main drainage areas next to one of our vineyard roads. We got a little bit of surface erosion, but it was hardly anything. And the positive impacts included that there is now grass sprouting all over the vineyard just in a week, which is always an amazing transformation to watch at this time of year. If you look up at the vines, there are sections that still look like we are in high autumn, kind of bright red leaves, looking like fall foliage. And then you turn around and look at a spot that has been frozen a few times and it looks like winter. So this is a Grenache block. The one before was looking up through some Syrah. So one of the other things about us getting out at the beginning of the autumn season, we've been prepping to make sure that we can take advantage of all of the rain that we're getting. So you can see, this is in our Muscardin, our tiny Muscardin block. You can see a row on the right that we have prepped and seeded, and a row on the left that we're leaving untilled. We're alternating rows, even in the blocks where we are tilling and seeding, we're alternating with untilled rows. So you can see the contrast here. And then, of course, this has given us the chance to get our flock of sheep back out in the vineyard. And I got a couple of beauty shots that I think are really fun. This one at sunset yesterday with the whole flock up at the top of that Syrah block that I took a picture of earlier. And right after I took this picture, I had Bjorn, our Mastiff, come up to say hello. And he's awesome, as always. So that's what's going on in the vineyard. There's not a ton of food out for the sheep yet. There's not really enough grass for them to eat. So they've been eating kind of second crop clusters that are still out there. Some of the leaves, it helps force the vines into dormancy. So it's a good thing. We'll move them around, and the grass grows fast once we get that first rain. Looks like we're going to get another 4 or 5 days of sun, and then it's supposed to get wet again kind of middle of next week, which is just perfect. And in preparation of that, one last picture, we've been spending a lot of time going out and making sure that anywhere that we think might be at risk of erosion gets covered with straw. That should hold things in place. Okay, so that is what we got going on right now. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to invite Joel to join me for the conversation. Okay, there. The list of people watching, and I just sent the invite to join over. How you doing, Joel?
Jason, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. I was wondering whether you were going to join me from the winery floor as you were in our test yesterday, or if you were going to pick a different location.
Well, this seemed like a better location. The winery floor was fabulous, and I like being there. But it's cold, and sort of sitting there half an hour or 45 minutes, this old body doesn't exude heat like it used to.
I sympathize greatly. So I gave everybody a very quick introduction, just that you were the founder of Ravenswood and of course, currently Once and Future Wine. But I would love to start at the beginning. Um, how did you get interested in wine in the first place? Was it something that you knew you wanted to do early on? Was it something that was on your family table as you were growing up, or was it something that you came to later?
Well, like you, I grew up in a family that was immersed in wine, not commercially the way yours was exactly. But my mother was a nuclear chemist who stayed home with her kids and got bored. So she decided to learn to cook because it was kind of like chemistry. And she read a book that said, oh, the French drank wine with their meals. And she was kind of thinking upwardly mobily. And she said, well, I want to try wine. She'd grown up actually in Bolinas, which is a little tiny coastal town. Most of my relatives were dairy farmers. And she went to the city of Paris and San Francisco in 1952 and asked for a bottle of wine that would go with Thanksgiving. The timing's perfect, actually, for this. And he gave her a bottle, and you'll love this. He gave her a bottle of 1945 Chateauneuf de Pape, probably Chateau Forcha. And it changed, it rocked the world, really. It changed the world. And my father got really interested in wine. He started a wine newsletter. My mother became an amazing cook. She did all the recipe testing for Alice Waters' first cookbook. And, ultimately, when you live in an environment where there's wine around all the time and people are immersed, my parents became sort of tourists. They loved to go to places where there was wine and food, and beauty, and like all those places, whether it be France or South Africa or Australia or here, they're all places that are magnificent. So ultimately, my father was writing a newsletter. He had to figure out words for wine. He thought that a 10-year-old would have interesting words for wine. So he would let me join his pre-tastings before his group met. And he'd let me smell wines. And he'd say things like, what's this wine smell like? And for Chardonnay, I might say it smells like apples. And he'd say, well, what kind of apples? And I'd say, I have no idea. So he'd go out and collect apples. He'd cut them up. He'd put them in glasses, and we'd smell apples until we could tell the difference between Northern Spy and Golden Delicious and Rome Beauty or whatever it was. And we did that with other things. Anytime I came up with what he considered a primary word, he would investigate that. So I got a really early education in aromatics and sensory stuff that most people don't get. And of course, that migrated ultimately into wine tasting. So by the time I was a teenager, I was kind of well integrated into wine tasting and different kinds of wines, but never thought about the wine business as a vocation. It was kind of what we did for fun, So I went off and studied, to be a scientist, and ultimately ended up as an immunologist in San Francisco for a while. And then I was doing my usual wine tasting things at the Vintners Club one day, and I ran into a guy sitting at my table whose name was Joe Swan. And we struck up this conversation, and ultimately one thing led to another. And I ended up spending a lot of time with Joe, helping him build his winery and really learning the nuts and bolts of winemaking, which I loved, it turned out. So ultimately that's the short version. I've got a longer version, but that'll get you
Dude,
there.
what a remarkable opportunity that must have been to develop that combination of vocabulary and taste and sense of smell as a kid. Like that, I mean, we all know that like kids have perceptions that are generally beyond the things that we can perceive when we're adults. Their senses are more acute, their brains are more flexible. You're less trapped by the things you think you know. So like I love that idea. Did you try to replicate that then, like with the next generation with your kids?
Well, not quite to the same extent that my father did it with me, but yes, obviously Morgan became an MW. There was a reason Morgan became an MW, was because he was exposed uh, to a lot of these same kinds of things, and I let him smell wine and taste wine early, so there was never any prohibition, and I really appreciated the the ability to be able to learn to use my organoleptic senses, which most of us are not taught to do. We're taught to use our eyes and our ears and speak, but we're not taught to how to smell things or understand what those smells are and how to correlate them to various things like wine. So I was very proactive about letting Morgan do that, and certainly with my other son, Galen, as well. And they're both really excellent tasters. And Morgan, obviously, being an MW is like, yeah, that's how you get your stripes, of course. And so he's really excellent at that. Not to mention that he has a memory which is, unbelievable. So that helps. I used to when he was a kid, I used to hold up his baseball cards for him. He had 1,000 of them, and I'd show him the picture on the front, and I'd say, "What's it say on the back?" And he'd recite the back to me, of whatever this player's statistics were and who he was, and da 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 da. Yeah, so that helped too.
I bet. Cool. So, would you talk a little bit about sort of the early days of Ravenswood? How did that come out? And I mean, because it's different helping somebody else with one of their projects and then envisioning and starting your own.
Well, really, I probably had no business starting a winery. It was, I don't think I really understood at the time what it entailed, but I loved the process so much that I just went ahead and did it. And it was, my hair was long and I was looking for a different vision of the world. It was a time when you could make changes like that. And I didn't have any obligations. My needs were small. I was living in Berkeley and doing a lot of Berkeley things. So it was the time for change. So I worked with Joe kind of on and off from 1972 until 1976, 1977, actually. But in 1976, I decided I was going to make wine. And I was going to make Zinfandel, which was kind of unusual. And so I went out, and with the help of Tom Dalinger and some other people, I managed to find a couple of people who would sell me old vine Zinfandel. And so I ended up ultimately buying a total of 8 tons of grapes and buying a redwood fermenter and moving it into Joe's facility and literally vinifying grapes old-fashioned way, kind of like Joe Swan did it. Open top fermenters, punched down by hand, native yeast fermentations, although Joe didn't use natives, but I did because I loved the kind of the French idea. I'd been well steeped in that concept. And French oak. And there I was. I had this wine in barrels. Okay, now what do you do with it? Well, you have to sell it. And, I was pretty much part of the Vintners Club. So my first 2 wines, ultimately, when they came out, there was a long route before I actually got those wines bottled. They moved around a few times. Joe Swan needed his space, so I moved to Mark West the next year. And the next year I moved to Tablas at Russian River Vineyards. I was kind of a peripatetic winery. I'd set up my wine so it was actually mobile. I mean, I could literally set it up and move it anywhere I needed to move it. I even had a short stint in Berkeley before I moved back to Sonoma. But my first bonded space was essentially a room next to the Topolis winery that was probably as big as a large bedroom. And so I basically did the bonding work for it. And I didn't have a clue. If you've ever looked at the complexities of getting a bonded space, and I'm like one guy that still have long hair and still am not really happy with bureaucracies per se. I end up going into the office at the ATF office with my paperwork, and I handed it to the inspector, whose name was David Lose. Oh, thank God I got David Lose. And he looked at it, and he looked at me, and he laughed, and he says, "You don't have a clue, do you?" And I said, "Yeah, you're right. I don't have a clue." He said, "I'm not supposed to do this, but let me help you out here." And so he, taught me how to do a plat and, how to gauge it and where to gauge it from and, what ingress, egress were. And ultimately, I ended up with a bonded winery as a result of that. So that was my first bond. and it's amazing. I mean, it was a relatively low bond number. I think there have been like 10,000 wineries online since between that bond number and the bond number I got for Once and Future. It was very funny. Um, but my first two wines did very well. They won tastings at the Vintners Club, beat out all the other famous Zinfandels at the time, and that kind of put me on the road. And of course, what you learn about making wine is that you have to sell wine too, and it's a whole different skill set. But fortunately, I like people, so it was fine. And as it turns out, I actually not only like the winemaking part of the business, but I love the actual process of going out and talking to people and selling wine and doing presentations for them. So yeah, it's a all-encompassing business, and it really focused on my strength. You know, it caught my science parts, it caught my social parts, it got my love for food and wine parts. So it was good. On the other hand, it didn't make any money. Uh, so so for years, I worked a second job. When Morgan was growing up, I ran a clinical laboratory at Sonoma on the weekends and at nights. And that's how I sort of kept body and soul together, you know, while doing the winery. But yeah, it was,
Body and soul and bank account.
yeah, mostly bank account, I guess. Probably. But
So,
yes,
so talk a little bit about, if you would, talk a little bit about your decision to focus on Zinfandel at the beginning. What was it about Zin at that time that drew you in?
well, you know, Joe Swan was really good friends with Andrei Chelichev, and so he ended up at the dinner table at the Swans, sometimes the lunch table at the Swans, frequently. And you know, he was a big Cabernet guy, and he was pushing a lot of that. But we had a long conversation, and I said, "Well, what's California's grape?" And he said, "Well, you're working with it. It's Zinfandel." He said, "But you know, that's probably not the future." And I said, you know, everybody's doing Cabernet. Robert Mondavi's doing Cabernet. Am I going to compete with Robert Mondavi? And the other part of it was that Joe Swan was making really amazing Zinfandel. His 1968 was legendary. It came off an old mixed black vineyard that was in his in where he planted Pinot Noir later on, and some wines from the Teldeschi Ranch in Dry Creek. And Ridge was doing, you know, really interesting things with Geyserville, and they were doing a Lytton Springs before they actually owned Lytton Springs. So there were some really good examples of wine that had been made seriously. Unfortunately, Zinfandel had kind of lost its cred because even though it was the most planted grape before Prohibition, it kind of turned into a home winemaker's wine and sweet wines and jug wines. So nobody thought you could make any money making Zinfandel. So they were all pushing for the new grape varieties, the Cabernet and the Chardonnay, and actually Pinot Noir was like a tragedy when I was growing up because it tasted like weeds, but and planted in all the wrong places. So and I also was, you know, raised in the European tradition. So if you go to France, you find there's certain grapes that are grown in certain places. You don't see Cabernet grown in the Rhone, and you don't see Pinot Noir grown in Bordeaux, but there are certain grapes that are right for the region, that are the signature grape for the region. And the grape in California that had all the characteristics of those vineyards was California, particularly Old Vine Zinfandel. They were dry farmed, you know, they were on wider spacing, they were head pruned, so, and they were low production. They were like, you know, under 3 tons an acre for the most part. And all those things meant quality. And it also lined up with what quality meant in other parts of the world. And so I said, okay, there's an opportunity here. The competitive world is smaller. If I do something well, I am likely to be recognized. And there's a way to grow in this world as well, because there are so many great old vineyards in California that can produce just terrific wine if they're treated with respect.
Absolutely. And I'm sure, I mean, from the time that you spent in Europe, I mean, if you were looking at these great older vine vineyards, there were not old vine vineyards of much other than Zinfandel available in California. Though, I mean, there clearly are older vineyards of other things that were pre-prohibition. I mean, older things that have sort of survived. But in terms of real scale around the state, like you picked the winner.
Yeah, I picked the winner, and it turned out that it was actually more than just Zinfandel.
Right.
It turned out that it was you as a Rhone guy, understand what blended vineyards are about, and so California was into this idea really early. I mean, like in 1880s, there were reports of people already beginning to mix up vineyards because they produced better wines. So these were not just Zinfandel vineyards per se. They weren't pure Zinfandel by any means. They were, anywhere between 60 and 80% Zinfandel. And the balance were what, when I was coming up in the business, was referred to as mixed blacks. And they refer to these as mixed black vineyards. So there'd be other grape varieties. The principal ones were Carignan, Alicante Bouschet, and Petit Syrah. But there was Mataro and at least 20 other varieties that had slipped in there historically. I mean, when California started in the wine world, they had no clue what they wanted to plant. So they brought in hundreds of grape varieties and experimented with them. And some of those ended up in these old vineyards, and they form really the character and the specialness of the place. They add to the terroir and the uniqueness of a particular location.
I've had conversations with Morgan over the years about some of the incredible discoveries that he's found in some of these old vineyards, things that like nobody had any idea had ever been brought to California, and even things that don't have an analog in the current banks in Europe, which suggests that they were probably lost to phylloxera at some point in Europe, and maybe they now only exist in California. It's like I don't think people realize the extent to which the wine industry in the late 19th, early 20th century in California was as experimental and as cutting edge and as diverse and interesting as it was.
I think you're absolutely right. It was fascinating because there were all these people who brought in grapes. There was Smith in the Central Valley. There was the Heresty collection that came in. There was Delmas. There were people in the South. They were all bringing in grapes and trying things. Up until that point, California had been pretty much living on the mission grape, and it didn't make great wine. Maybe Angelica would be the exception. But when the gold rush happened and people began to come to California, they clearly saw an opportunity to plant things besides the mission grape, and particularly when grape growing moved north, because Los Angeles had been a big center, and it's likely that Pearson's disease ultimately wiped that out. But when the grape growing moved north, the climate was such that it was probably more facile for these European grape varieties to be grown and produced really interesting and good wines. So it was hugely experimental, and people were, taking whole flyers on wines and wineries and things they didn't really know about. And ultimately, it all collapsed, of course, with a recession, and ultimately, almost all the vineyards ended up in the California Wine Association's possession. And interestingly enough, I grew up in a little town called Point Richmond, and right around the corner from my house was a place called Point Mulati. And Point Mulati had a winery called Wine Haven on it, which was the California Wine Association's production facility before Prohibition. And it was the largest winery in the world. And they actually built it like a castle. And it actually still exists. It was used as a fuel dump during World War II, but it was remarkable. they were sending 40 tankers a year uh, to New York. They had a giant dock that looked like an oil dock, and they were sending tank cars out. They had a rail line. I mean, this was like a big production. It was Gallo on steroids, I guess. So it was a pretty remarkable place. But you look at pictures of it, and some of the early pictures of it show them making wine in very large open top redwood fermenters, much like I use, except they're much smaller. So it's
Huh.
pretty amazing to think about how the business transformed itself, not only from the experiments of, grapes, what to grow, how to grow them, and then ultimately kind of collapsing and being, held together by one large organization, and then recovery from prohibition. And even in my era, the changes that have happened between when I started and what we do now are profound.
I mean, it's more than half the kind of modern lifespan of California wine, so it's not surprising. Uh, but I do want to I want to talk a little bit about kind of your path. I mean, obviously Ravenswood grew Ravenswood a huge amount, and then it was purchased and became a part of a larger wine company, um, and then you sort of went back to the beginning with what you're doing at Once and Future, and I think that's fascinating, and I'd love to hear why and how that happened.
Well, the whole process of was almost an accident. It wasn't something I intended, but sometimes when you like to make wine, you can't stop making wine. One of my partners, Reed Foster, who was sort of the financial back for this, um, used to say, "You've never met a grape you don't love," which wasn't exactly true, but it was one of those kinds of things. Once you get into the habit of making wine and have figured it out, and once you have the process, it's easy to grow as long as you have a market for the wines you make. And in 1983, we were kind of going broke making expensive wine, and discovered something called Vintner's Blend, which was an inexpensive Zinfandel that I made in slightly lighter style, but still made it authentic and not sweet, and, with good French oak associated with it. And it was priced around $10 or $12 a bottle.
I mean, that was
And
my introduction to Zinfandel. I mean, and
yep,
I'm sure one of hundreds of thousands of people for whom that was true.
yeah, I still have people come up to me and say, the first red wine I ever drank was your Zinfandel, Vintner's Blend. It turned me into a red wine drinker. And I'm saying, God bless you. That's fantastic. So yeah, I mean, before it was all said and done, I was selling nearly 1 million cases of Vintner's Blend a year, and also doing my single vineyard wines, which were really the wines of my heart, the ones that I really appreciated. And I had an ace, team working with me. People like Peter Matheson, Jen Bellows, and Gary Sitton, who are all still in the wine business, all still doing interesting stuff. Um, but it was it was an adventure. It was fun. When I was like living in Berkeley, they used to say it's the journey, not the goal. And it's been a hell of a journey, I can tell you. It's been quite amazing. But you know, after working for Constellation for 16 years, I kind of decided that I had to sort of uh, decide what I wanted to do really with the rest of my life. I mean, I'm now 75, and so I was 67 at the time, and so I said, well, you probably have another 10 or 15 years left in you. What do you want to do? And if I really examined the wine business and asked myself when I was the happiest, I mean, it's all been joyful in many ways, but when I was the happiest is when I was making wine on a small scale and doing nearly everything myself. It satisfied a lot of needs. It satisfied the need to be active. It satisfied the need to be creative. Uh, it satisfied the need to give some people something that made them happy. And and so I decided that I'd go back and be a one-man winery again because I could, and because ultimately there's enough superstructure built around me so I can get away with it. Uh, I make my wine in the same fermenters I was using in the 1980s in Morgan's winery. And so while I do the majority of the work, he has a really ace team that helps me out when I need help, uh, and so I'm able to do things that I might not be able to do, and it's really great. I'm only making wines that I love, making them in a way that I like to make them, not making so much that I can't sell it, and and still get to engage on a daily basis with the wine people and people like you and people like Morgan and people like Chris Cottrell and people like Joanna Eland. And, there's just this like whole group of people that make the wine business a lovely place to work.
You just encapsulated things that I've tried to say with less eloquence than that, about why I love what I'm doing. It's an outlet for a whole bunch of different facets of my personality, and it sounds like it's the same for you. And I mean, something that we have in common is that, like, we were both able to combine business and family in a way that's made it all the more rewarding. So can you talk a little bit about that piece of it, getting to work with Morgan, how you made that happen, and or how you think about that as a piece of your broader life and picture and legacy?
Yeah, no, I'm very fortunate in that way. I honestly didn't expect Morgan to be in the wine business. I expected him to be a professor of history somewhere. Yeah, he's very much the historian even now when you read his write-ups of wine and things. And I guess, my strategy, if there was a strategy, was not to force him to be in the wine business, but to engage him along the way. So he always felt like part of it. He grew up in the winery. They're sort of, stomping grapes and, and, cleaning up, around the press and things. It just was little. I mean, it was fun for him. We did this together. And, his mother was gone a lot when he was young. She was going to nursing school. So I ended up with him at the winery. It was kind of my shadow. And it was great. I mean, it was really fabulous, except for the one day when this couple showed up that wanted to see the winery. It wasn't when I had a lot of visitors. And I think Morgan must have been 9 or something like that. And they said, well, we'd like to see the winery. And I said, well, that's great. I'll share some wines with you. But right now I'm cleaning out a tank. If you could wait around for another 20 or 30 minutes, I'll take care of it. So I get out of my tank and I'm looking around, and there's no Morgan and there's no people. And I'm thinking, oh my, Morgan, it sold my son, and I'm just as I'm getting ready to call the police, these people drive back up and Morgan is in their car. I'm saying, what's going on? And then, and they said, well, Morgan said he'd show us the vineyard and we just thought it was a normal everyday thing. So that was it. So he was kind of really engaged, but he went off to school in New York, and I didn't really expect him to be back. And my strategy was not to try to force him into the wine business, but let him come back. But he always was tasting and learning about wine. He gave courses, wine when he was in college, and it caught him, which is great. And to have him come back and to be able to help him sort of establish his own business independent of mine, because I was in a position to do that, fortunately, which is great. It's really special. And the fact that he's gone on to do it as well as he's done it, and he's sort of outstripped me in many ways, which I'm grateful for. It's fantastic. He will own his winery longer than I owned mine, which is fantastic. And it's nice to see him grow and continue to do well. And now I have a grandchild, so we'll see what kind of strategy that is. But he's already stomping grapes at 2.5.
Yeah, it's amazing, and I think your strategy is is the right one if you want it, if you want this to work multi-generationally. And I know my dad had very much the same approach, which was like, hold the door open and show the interesting things on the other side of it without making me feel like I was being pushed through it.
Yep.
And it made it something that I looked forward to rather than something that I felt was an obligation or somehow being forced upon me.
And I think that's probably the only way it works ultimately, because the minute you start trying to force your children in a direction, they they either resent it and hate you for it the rest of their lives, or they just don't go in that direction. They just rebel and go some other direction. So, you know, yeah, the strategy of holding opportunity open is exactly the right one. I love your image of holding the door open and showing what's on the other side. That's a really good vision. Yeah.
Okay, so we're basically at half an hour. I try to keep these to half an hour, but there was one that came in, which was actually the question related to the question that I had for you, that I wanted to end with, which was, um, sort of, do you have you've spent a lot of time looking at kind of California's past, and I had the pleasure of hearing you speak a few weeks ago up at the conference we were both at the American Wine Society up in Seattle, about how these things which come from our past are also potential avenues for the future of California wine, and a future which is likely to be drier and hotter than our present and recent past. Could you talk a little bit about what you see as kind of a viable future for wine in California?
Yeah, there's no doubt we're already seeing the effects of climate. You can see it in Napa Cabernet, for instance. The between the drought and the heat waves, um, the berries are smaller. The wines are much more concentrated than they've ever been, to the point where I was sitting at a table at the AWS, and the guy next to me had just opened up a bottle of new California Cabernet, Napa Valley, and he said, and he poured himself a glass, and he tasted, and he said, "This wine's too big. I don't like this. They all taste the same." So ultimately, when everything gets ripe and intense, it's all ripe and intense, and you lose the integrated character you get from wines that are picked a little bit earlier or not so subject to the stresses that are associated with climate change. So, as I see it, that means that you have to sort of begin to focus on grapes and wine growing strategies that are more suited to where the climate is going. And you already grow them in some ways, things, grapes that are grown in already hot regions, uh, like the Rhone or and Portuguese varieties or such things, or the way California had already begun doing it, Zinfandel in mixed black vineyards are going to be the future, in part because those grapes tend to be more productive to start with, and they tend to be bigger. Mediterranean grapes tend to be bigger than, say, some of the northern varieties like Cabernet. And so even if they reduce in size, they get more concentrated, but they don't become, the sameness doesn't become dominant. And you're planting blended vineyards because there's always one grape variety that will do well in almost any condition. So you're more likely to get a viable, interesting wine. You're using strategies, like you guys are using with cover crops and humus and soil to do more water retention, but also demanding less from close spacing and big trellising systems, which utilize a lot more water. So you're being smarter about canopy management and things like that. So a combination of those things, the choices of grape varieties, and in California we're also looking at grape varieties that have come. I mean, we have this big grape library ultimately out there. So things like Mataro and grape varieties that like Castay that nobody's really ever heard of, that we can play with. Morgan is in the process of cleaning some of those up, so we'll be actually able to see what they do. We've got an experimental section of the vineyard planted, but we're also beginning to plant new mixed black vineyards. We're doing Portuguese varieties. We're obviously doing some Rhone varieties like Grenache, that are all things that I think will make better wines, more interesting wines in the future, and will actually be the future of California when Cabernet is moved to Oregon or Canada.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's an opportunity and a resource that we have in California, is that there are a lot of grapes that have been here for a really long time. But there are also, I mean, thousands of grapes that have never yet been here that are used to make wine around the world. Many of them in places that are hotter and drier than the places maybe that California looked to for its models in the 20th century. So um, it'll be an exciting thing to see and try to help figure out over the coming decades, because I think it's pretty clear to everybody who's been making wine here, even not as long as you, but even in the last 20 years, there have been some really big, noticeable, measurable changes that are putting stress on the old models.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. It was interesting you mentioned how experimental it was in the 1800s. We're kind of going into that phase again, and it's kind of exciting. It's like I hope I live long enough to see, the those transitions come to fruition and some of the wines that are going to be made, because I think some of them are going to be very special and very interesting.
I could not agree more. Amazing. So I think that's a perfect place to end. Thank you, Joel, for spending a piece of your Wednesday afternoon talking about this. It was such a pleasure.
Well, it's a great pleasure to talk to you, Jason. Thank you so much. I obviously love this business and I love to talk about it. And you're a really good inheritor of the whole legacy of the California business. You guys have been at it for a long time. So thank you.
Thank you. Last thing, if people want to learn more about what you're working on now at Once and Future, what's the best way for them to do it?
Go to my website, onceandfuturewine.com. Got a rundown of the grapes I'm working with, the old vineyards I'm working with. Yeah, and you can't order wine directly, but I have releases, and I will share. I am delighted. I am having such a good time, and the more people look at it, the more people that get involved with me, the better off I am, and I'll get to do it for even longer.
I love it. Okay, excellent. Thank you, Joel. It's been
Thank
such.
you. Talk to you later.
Bye.